Cole Hargrove hadn't stepped inside a building in 3 months. He hadn't asked a living soul for anything in 4 years. But that July morning, he walked through the door of Copper Falls schoolhouse with his nephew limp in his arms and blood on his shirt. And he looked straight at the red-headed teacher like she was the only solid thing left in the world. "Help him," he said. That was all. It was the first word that broke him open. The second word would change everything. Before we go further, tell us what city you're watching from. Drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if it moves you, subscribe, because tomorrow I have something waiting for you that you won't want to miss. Margaret Holt had sent the last child home 20 minutes ago, and she was still at her desk. That was the pattern. The children left, the noise left, the laughter left, and she stayed, because the schoolhouse was the one place in Copper Falls where her presence was required, rather than merely tolerated. She was grading arithmetic slates when she heard the boots on the porch steps. Heavy, uneven, like a man carrying more than his own weight. She looked up. The door opened, and Cole Hargrove walked in, with a 13-year-old boy hanging unconscious in his arms. "Help him." His voice was rough stone. "Please." Margaret was already moving. She cleared her desk with one arm, scattering papers and chalk, and the journal she kept locked and never let anyone see. "Lay him down, gently. What happened?" "Snake." Cole set Danny down with a care that contradicted the size of his hands entirely. "Timber rattler. Got him on the left calf, hour ago, maybe. Horse threw a shoe on the ridge. Took me too long to get down." Margaret had already pulled the boy's pant leg up. The bite was ugly, swollen purple and tight. 2 clean puncture marks surrounded by skin the color of a bruised peach. Danny's breathing was shallow but even. "He's burning up." She pressed the back of her hand to the boy's forehead. "How long has he had fever?" "Since the halfway mark down the mountain." "Did you cut it?" "First thing." "Did you draw the wound?" "Yes." "How much came out?" Cole went quiet for exactly 1 second. "Not enough." Margaret stood up and looked at him directly for the first time. Cole Hargrove was not a man you looked at by accident. He was the kind of presence that filled a room by simply breathing. 6'3" of weathered mountain granite, dark hair pushed back from a face that had spent considerable time arguing with the weather. There was a scar running from his left jaw down to his collar that looked like the land had tried to keep him once, and nearly succeeded. His eyes were gray, not soft gray, ridgestone gray, and right now they were fixed on the boy with an expression so stripped down and raw that Margaret felt it like a physical thing. "There's a doctor in town," she said. "Morrison's in Cheyenne. Won't be back till Thursday. Ruth Calloway keeps herbs at the inn. I came here first." He said it like it was the obvious choice, like it had never been any other option. Margaret looked at him. "Why?" "Because Danny talks about you." Cole's jaw worked for a moment. "Every time he comes down from the mountain for school. He says Miss Holt knows everything and tells the truth and doesn't talk down to him like he's stupid." A pause. Figured that was a good enough recommendation. Something moved in Margaret's chest that she immediately pushed back down. "I need my medical kit from the residence behind the schoolhouse," she said. "Stay with him. Don't let him turn on his side." "I won't." She believed him completely. She was back in 4 minutes with willow bark, a clean cloth, her small brown medical kit that every frontier teacher learned to keep stocked, and a tin of drawing salve her mother had sent from Boston that Margaret had always felt slightly embarrassed about owning. Danny was exactly where she'd left him, and Cole was exactly where she'd left him, crouched beside the desk, one massive hand wrapped around the boy's smaller one, not speaking, just present. like a mountain holding still for something fragile to rest against. "Talk to him," Margaret said, uncorking the salve. "He's unconscious." "That doesn't mean he can't hear you. Talk to him." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, gruffly, like a man not accustomed to the sound of his own voice in a room, "Hey, Danny, you listening?" Nothing from the boy. Cole cleared his throat. "Your mare's going to be fine. Fixed the shoe myself on the ridge. She's tied outside, eating your teacher's window flowers, and you're going to owe an apology for that when you wake up." The boy's face twitched, the faintest pull at one corner of his mouth. "There he is," Margaret said quietly. Cole exhaled through his nose. It wasn't relief exactly. It was the sound of a man who had been holding himself together by pure force of will, and had just been given permission to ease the grip slightly. They worked in a focused silence for the better part of an hour, Margaret applying the drawing salve and rebandaging the wound, pressing willow bark tea between Danny's lips in small, patient measures, checking his pulse at regular intervals. Cole held the boy still when he shuddered. He handed Margaret what she needed before she asked for it twice: the cloth, the water, the second strip of clean linen, with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to read a situation and respond without commentary. When Danny's color began to shift from alarming back toward merely pale, Margaret sat back and let herself breathe. "He needs to stay still tonight," she said. "The swelling needs to come down before you take him back up the mountain." "I know." "I mean completely still, Mr. Hargrove. Not an hour's rest and then a 3-hour ride up a ridge." "I said, I know." He looked at her, and there was something almost sharp in it. Not offense, but precision. He wasn't a man who needed things said twice. "Where can he sleep?" "There's a cot in the residence. I'll set it up." "I'm obliged." He pulled his hat from where he'd dropped it on the floor and turned it in his hands. A slow rotation that she was beginning to understand was what Cole Hargrove did instead of fidgeting. "Miss Holt." "You don't have to thank me. He needed help." "I'm not thanking you. Yet." He looked at her steadily. "I'm about to ask you something." The quiet in the schoolhouse was very complete. "All right," Margaret said carefully. "I need a wife." She stared at him. "Danny needs a mother," he continued, the words measured and deliberate, like a man reading from a document he'd composed very carefully in his head over a long ride down a mountain. "He's been without one for 3 years. I've been without—" He stopped, started again. "I don't know how to be both things to him. I know how to feed him and keep him safe and teach him the mountain. I don't know how to teach him the rest of it. How to talk to people. How to sit still in a room without feeling like the walls are closing in." A pause. How to have someone to talk to when the work's done and the dark comes in. Margaret realized her hands were folded in her lap. She didn't remember folding them. "Mr. Hargrove." "Cole." "Cole." The name felt strange in her mouth. Direct, like the man himself. "You've been in this schoolhouse for approximately 90 minutes. You don't know me. I know you sat with my nephew for an hour without once making him feel like a burden." His gray eyes didn't move from hers. "I know you've been teaching children in this county for 8 years, and not one parent has pulled their child from your classroom. I know you live alone in that residence back there, and you've done it so long that the whole town stopped noticing you're doing it." He paused. "And I know that ain't the same as being all right with it." The accuracy of it landed somewhere she wasn't prepared for. "You don't know anything about my life," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "No." He didn't flinch from it. "But I'm willing to learn, if you're willing to let me." Margaret made tea she didn't drink. She stood at the small stove in the schoolhouse kitchen, listening to Cole move quietly in the back room where he'd settled Danny, and she tried to arrange her thoughts into something resembling order. It was a thing she was usually very good at. Order was her profession, her armor, her Sunday church clothes, and her weekday working boots all at once. She had come to Copper Falls at 26 with a teaching certificate, a trunk full of books, and a particular species of humiliation that still occasionally surfaced in her sleep. The memory of standing in her mother's parlor in Boston, while a man named Gerald Whitmore explained to her mother, in careful, courteous terms, that he had reconsidered the engagement on the grounds of practicality. Her mother had nodded along. That was the part Margaret had never quite forgiven. She had built something real here, something that belonged to her and no one else. Her classroom, her students, the small journal she filled with lines of poetry that no one would ever read because the frontier had very little patience for a schoolteacher who wrote verse by lamplight. She had made her peace with solitude, or so she told herself, on the evenings when she could hear Ruth Calloway's inn 2 streets over, filling up with voices and laughter and the sound of people who had chosen each other. "You're thinking too hard." She turned. Cole was in the doorway, hat still in his hands. "He's sleeping," he said. "Real sleep. Breathing's even." "Good." She set down her cup. "Mr. Cole, I appreciate what you said. I understand it comes from genuine concern for your nephew. But what you're describing—" "A marriage. A transaction," she corrected. "You need domestic help and a maternal figure for a grieving child. I understand the logic. I don't understand why you're asking me specifically when there are women in this county who—" "Name one." She opened her mouth, closed it. "Name one woman in Copper Falls," he said, not unkindly, "who would live on a mountain, teach a hard boy who doesn't trust easily, keep her own mind about her, and not spend the first 6 months trying to turn me into something I ain't." The silence was not comfortable exactly, but it was honest. "That's a very specific list of requirements," Margaret said finally. "I'm a specific man." He set his hat on the counter with the deliberate care of someone trying to look less formidable. "I ain't asking for love, Miss Holt. I ain't going to stand here and tell you things I don't know yet are true. But I know Danny, and I know what he needs. And when he woke up this morning, first thing he said before I got him on the horse was, 'Uncle Cole, do you think Miss Holt would mind if I stayed a few days?'" Cole's jaw tightened briefly. "That boy hasn't asked for anything in 3 years. Not one thing. He just goes quiet and handles whatever comes." Margaret felt something crack open very quietly behind her sternum. "He asked for you," Cole said simply. "I figured that meant something." She was still standing there when the inn door across the street opened, and Harlan Voss stepped out. She knew his footsteps by now. Precise, measured. The footsteps of a man who moved through the world like he owned it. Because in Copper Falls, he largely did. Silver Crown Mine, the deed to half the town's commercial lots, and the title of deputy mayor had a way of making a man's footsteps sound different from everyone else's. He was handsome in the groomed, careful way of men who had time to be handsome. Silver at his temples, that arrived too conveniently. A smile that was always exactly the right width. He saw her through the schoolhouse window and raised a hand. She raised hers back, because not doing so would have required an explanation she didn't have energy for tonight. Cole turned to look at what she was looking at. Something in his posture changed. Not aggression exactly. More like a wall deciding to become a wall more completely. "You know Voss well?" His voice had shifted. Careful now. Measured. "He's on the school board. He's been attentive." She chose the word deliberately and watched Cole hear what she meant behind it. "Attentive," Cole repeated. "He has a particular interest in the school program and in the town's future." She paused. and apparently in mine. Cole was quiet for a long moment. Has he made you any kind of offer? Not in explicit terms, but he has suggested that a woman in my position. She stopped herself, irritated at how much she was revealing to a man she had known for less than 2 hours. A woman in your position, Cole said quietly. Meaning unmarried. Meaning unmarried and approaching an age where the town's patience with the arrangement grows thinner every year. She said it flatly, because that was the only way to say it without it becoming something else. He has been very kind about suggesting I might benefit from a different kind of security. Cole turned away from the window. His gray eyes came back to her face with a directness that should have been rude, but somehow wasn't. Harlan Voss ain't kind, he said. He's calculating. There's a difference, and on this mountain I've had 8 years to learn it. He picked his hat back up. I don't know what he wants from you, Miss Holt, but I'd wager it ain't your happiness. That's a significant accusation about the deputy mayor. It is. He didn't soften it. Think about it. He slept in the chair beside Danny's cot. Margaret had offered the floor, which was admittedly not a generous offer. He had shaken his head and folded himself into the schoolhouse chair with the patient practicality of a man accustomed to sleeping in worse places, which, given the mountain, she believed entirely. She lay on her own bed in the residence and stared at the ceiling and did not sleep. She thought about Danny, 13 years old, and asking for her. She thought about Cole's voice when he'd said, I don't know how to be both things to him. She thought about 8 years of walking home to a room that held only her own breathing. She thought about Gerald Whitmore in her mother's parlor, and the careful way he'd avoided her eyes, and the way her mother had nodded. She thought about the journal under her mattress, the one full of lines she'd never read aloud, because there was no one to read them to. She thought about Cole Hargrove sitting in that schoolhouse chair right now, in the dark, with his nephew's hand probably still in his, and his father's old hat probably still in the other, turning it. She got up at 5 in the morning and made coffee. He was already awake. He was standing in the kitchen doorway, looking out the window at the mountains, the way a man looks at something that is both home and demand at once. He's better, Cole said without turning around. Fever broke about an hour ago. I heard him shift. She moved past him to the stove. Sit down. I'm fine. Sit down, Cole. The name again, strange and direct. He sat. She poured 2 cups and set one in front of him and sat across the table, and they were quiet together in the particular way of 2 people who have passed a difficult night in proximity and come through it to the other side. My wife left, he said, after a while. Not dramatically, just the way you'd state weather or distance. 4 years ago. Couldn't take the mountain. I don't blame her for it. His thumb traced the grain of the table. She took what she needed, and she went. Danny was 9. He didn't understand why she went, and I didn't know how to explain it without making it sound like the mountain was the wrong choice. And the mountain ain't the wrong choice. It's my life. It's his life. Margaret wrapped her hands around her cup. I'm not asking you to replace her, he said. I want to be clear about that. You'd come as yourself, not as anyone's substitute. What exactly would I be coming as? My wife. Danny's... He paused. Whatever he'll let you be to him. That part takes time, and I won't pretend otherwise. And you? What would I be to you? He looked at her directly. Someone I talk to when the work's done. A beat. Someone whose presence in a room changes the room. I forgot what that felt like. He picked up his coffee, set it down. I'd like to remember. The sun came through the window and caught his scar and the gray in his eyes, and the very slight tension in his jaw that told her this was costing him more than he was letting on. "I'll need time to consider," she said. "I know. I have conditions. I'd think less of you if you didn't. I keep teaching. Non-negotiable." "Agreed. My books come with me. I'll build you a shelf. I need my own space. Not separate rooms forever, but my own space initially. My own pace." "You set the pace. No hesitation. I waited 4 years before I opened my mouth. I can wait a reasonable amount longer for anything worth waiting for." She looked at him for a long moment. This enormous, quiet, scar-faced man sitting at her small kitchen table, asking for something he didn't have the vocabulary for, and knowing he didn't have it, and asking anyway. "I'll give you my answer by Sunday," she said. He nodded, rose, and put on his hat. "Cole." He stopped at the door. "What you said about Harlan Voss." She folded her hands. "Is there something I should know? Something specific?" The pause before he answered was half a second too long. "Not yet," he said, "but I think there might be soon." He looked back at her with those gray mountain eyes. "That's another reason I'd rest easier knowing you weren't alone." He walked out. Margaret sat with her cooling coffee and the particular silence he left behind, which felt different from every other silence she had sat with in 8 years, and tried very hard to convince herself that she had not already decided. She was not entirely successful. Ruth Calloway appeared at her door before noon. Ruth Calloway always appeared. It was one of the great constants of Copper Falls, like summer heat and the sound of the minecart wheels, and the way the sky turned that specific, impossible gold over the ridge at dusk. "Cole Hargrove left his horse outside your schoolhouse all night," Ruth said, stepping inside without being invited, because Ruth Calloway had never waited to be invited anywhere in her 60 years of living. "The whole town's been talking about it since breakfast. Danny was bitten by a rattler. He needed to stay the night. The whole town knows that, too." Ruth sat herself down at a student's desk with the comfortable authority of a woman who fit everywhere she planted herself. "The whole town is also saying that Cole Hargrove sat in your kitchen this morning, drinking coffee like he belonged there." "He sat in my kitchen, drinking coffee." Ruth looked at her with the particular sharp warmth of a woman who had survived enough of life to see through most of its performances. "And?" Margaret was quiet for a moment. "He asked me to marry him." Ruth's expression did not change. "Well," she said, after a thoughtful pause, "it's about time somebody did." "Ruth," "Don't Ruth me in that voice. I've watched you walk home to that empty residence every evening for 8 years, and I've watched you tell yourself it was enough." The older woman leaned forward. "Is it enough?" The question sat in the room. "Harlan Voss came by while I was considering it," Margaret said, instead of answering. "He seemed very interested in the fact that Cole had been here." Ruth's expression shifted, sharpened. "What did he say?" "He was very polite. He said he hoped the boy recovered quickly, and that he hoped I wasn't feeling obligated to offer hospitality beyond what the situation required, and that if I found myself in need of any kind of stability, his door was always open." "His door," Ruth repeated flatly. "His exact word." Ruth was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. "Margaret, I've known Harlan Voss for 11 years. I've watched him run 3 families out of this county. I've watched him smile at funerals. And I've watched him look at you for the past 6 months, the way a man looks at something he's decided to acquire." She stood up. "Cole Hargrove is a hard man who lives on a hard mountain and doesn't say much. But what he says, he means. And he has never, in all the years I've known him, looked at a person like they were something to be acquired. She picked up her shawl. "Think about that," she said. "Then give him your answer." Danny Hargrove was sitting up when Margaret checked on him at midday. He was pale, and his leg was still propped on a folded blanket. But his eyes were clear and dark, and watching her with the careful attention of a boy who had learned early that reading people was a survival skill. "You stayed," he said. "This is my schoolhouse." She sat in the chair Cole had vacated. "Where else would I go?" "Uncle Cole said you might not want us here." He looked at his hands. "Underfoot," that was his word. "Your uncle uses interesting words for a man who uses so few of them." Danny almost smiled. It arrived and disappeared so fast, she nearly missed it. "He talks more on the mountain, when it's just us. He talks to the horses most, but sometimes to me too." A pause. "He told me about the snakes up on the North Trail last week. He told me which ones to watch for, and which ones are just scared, and which ones mean it." His jaw set in a way that was very familiar. "I should have remembered. You were 13 and probably looking at something else entirely." "A hawk," he admitted. "Red-tailed. It was hunting." "Then you were being observant. You were just observing the wrong thing." He looked at her with those watchful eyes. "Uncle Cole says that about himself sometimes, that he was watching the wrong thing when—" He stopped. "When?" "When my aunt left." He said it carefully, like handling something that had been broken and repaired and might break again. "He says he was watching the ranch and not watching her, that he got the balance wrong." He looked up at Margaret. "He doesn't talk about her much, but when he does, he always says it was his fault for not seeing what she needed." Margaret held very still. "He sees things now," Danny said. "He's real careful about seeing things now." Those dark eyes met hers. "He saw you, before he ever came down here. He's mentioned you. Not a lot, but more than once." He paused. "For Uncle Cole, that's the same as a lot." She didn't trust herself to say anything to that. "Miss Holt." Danny looked at his wrapped leg. "If you said yes, would you be scared?" The honesty of the question, its absolute lack of pretense, hit her square in the chest. "Yes," she said. "Probably." He nodded, like that was the right answer. "Uncle Cole's scared too. He just doesn't say so because he thinks it'll make him sound less reliable." A pause. "But I can tell. He's scared of getting the balance wrong again." Margaret looked at this pale, careful, grave-eyed boy who would ask for her by name from the back of a horse on a mountain trail, while snake venom worked its way up his leg. She thought about empty evenings. She thought about the journal under her mattress. She thought about Harlan Voss and his precise footsteps and his exactly right width smile. She thought about a man turning his hat in his hands in the dark. "Danny," she said, "you should sleep." "I know." He lay back, wincing slightly. "Miss Holt?" "Yes?" "For what it's worth," he pulled the blanket up, "I think you'd be good at it." "At what?" He was already closing his eyes. "Being part of something." Margaret sat in that chair for a long time after he fell asleep, her hands folded in her lap, listening to the sound of the summer afternoon moving through Copper Falls around her. The mine carts, the voices from the inn, the school bell she would ring again in the morning. And somewhere up on Black Elk Ridge, a man who had ridden down a mountain with his nephew bleeding in his arms, and had walked into her schoolhouse like she was the only solid thing left in the world. She looked at the sleeping boy. She looked at the window. She made her decision 3 days before Sunday. She walked up the mountain on the Thursday morning. She hadn't planned it that way. She had planned to send word through Ruth, a polite note folded twice, with her answer written in the careful schoolteacher hand she used for official correspondence. That was the sensible approach, the measured approach, the approach of a woman who had spent 8 years building walls and calling them independence. She lasted until Wednesday evening. Then she put on her walking boots, told Clara Webb's father that she'd be late opening the schoolhouse, and started up the South Trail toward Black Elk Ridge, with the summer heat already pressing down on her shoulders like a hand. It took her 2 hours to find the ranch. She smelled the horses first, then the sound of hammering, steady, rhythmic, the kind of work that had a patience built into it. She came around the last bend in the trail and stopped. Cole was repairing a fence post, his back to her, his shirt dark with work and the July heat. Danny was sitting on the top rail watching him, with the easy comfort of a boy who had grown up watching this man and found it sufficient company. His bandaged leg was stretched out in front of him, no longer swollen. Danny saw her first. His face did something complicated. Surprise, then something cautious, then something carefully neutral that was probably trying very hard not to be hope. Cole turned. He looked at her for one long moment. Then he set down his hammer. "Miss Holt, I told you I'd give you my answer by Sunday." She stopped 6 feet away and folded her hands in front of her because old habits are the last things to go. "I decided not to wait." The hammering of her own heart was considerably louder than anything else on the mountain. "And?" he said. "Yes." Cole went very still. "With conditions," she added. "You said. And I mean them. All of them." "I heard every one." His voice was steady, but something behind it was not. "I accepted every one." "Then yes." She looked at him directly. "My answer is yes, Cole." Danny made a sound that was trying very hard not to be anything in particular, and failing completely. He pressed his mouth shut and looked at the horizon with tremendous concentration. Cole crossed the distance between them in 4 strides and held out his hand. Not an embrace, not a declaration. Just his hand, open and steady, offered like a man who understood that some things had to be chosen carefully and not grabbed at. She took it. His fingers closed around hers with a gentleness that was wildly at odds with the size of them. "All right," he said quietly. "All right." That was all. But standing there, on that mountain, with the summer pressing in around them, and Danny pretending to study the sky, it was enough. It was considerably more than enough. The town of Copper Falls had opinions. This was not surprising. A town of 400 souls on the edge of the frontier survived partly on weather, partly on silver, and largely on the circulation of other people's business. Margaret had known this for 8 years. She had simply never been the subject of it before. Ruth Calloway told her Thursday evening over the counter of the inn. "Agnes Hartwell says it's disgraceful." Ruth set down a coffee cup with a decisive click. "Says a schoolteacher taken up with a mountain man is setting a poor example for the children. Says you've clearly lost your senses." Agnes Hartwell lost her own senses sometime around 1871, and hasn't missed them since, Margaret said. Ruth's mouth twitched. "Tom Briggs from the feed store says Cole Hargrove is too rough for a woman of your education. Says you'll be miserable up on that ridge inside a year." Tom Briggs has never been above 3,000 feet in his life. "Mrs. Patterson," Ruth. Margaret set down her own cup. "Is there a point to this inventory, or are we just cataloging?" Ruth looked at her steadily. "Harlan Voss came into the inn this afternoon." The room got quieter. "He heard," Ruth continued, "word travels fast when Cole Hargrove rides down the mountain with Margaret Holt on a horse in front of him to register a marriage intention at the county office. She paused. Which, for the record, I thought was a very efficient use of a Thursday. What did Voss say? He was very pleasant, congratulated the match, said he hoped you'd be very happy. Ruth's eyes were steady and not pleasant at all. Then he asked me, very casually, whether I knew anything about the Hargrove property survey from 1887. Margaret went still. I told him I didn't. Ruth leaned forward. Margaret, Harlan Voss does not ask casual questions. In 11 years, I have never once seen that man say a thing he didn't mean to say. She lowered her voice. 3 years ago, before you came to town, a miner named Ed Cass found a secondary vein on the North Ridge, above Cole's property. He told 3 people about it and was dead of a riding accident 6 weeks later. The coffee in Margaret's cup had gone cold. You think... I don't think anything, Ruth straightened. I'm saying Ed Cass is dead, and Harlan Voss owns the claim on the adjacent land. And now Harlan Voss is asking questions about the Hargrove survey. She held Margaret's gaze. That's all I'm saying. Margaret told Cole on Friday. She had ridden up alone this time, on the spare horse Ruth had lent her, because the older woman had pressed the reins into her hand, without a word, and that was Ruth's version of saying something very loudly. Cole listened to everything she said without interrupting once. That was something she was already learning about him. He listened the way he hammered fence posts, with his whole attention, no part of him elsewhere. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Ed Cass, he said finally. You knew him? He came to me once, about 6 months before he died. Cole's jaw tightened. He said he thought there was silver below my north pasture, said the rock formation matched what he'd seen elsewhere. A pause. I told him I wasn't interested, that I ran horses, not a mine, and I didn't want men with equipment tearing up my land. Did you tell anyone else? No, didn't think it mattered. His voice had gone flat in a way that was different from his usual quiet. This was the flat of a man rearranging what he thought he knew. Cass is dead, and now Voss is asking about my survey. Cole, I'm not scared of Harlan Voss. He said it without heat, which made it more convincing than if he'd said it with fire in it. But I'd like to know what he knows before he decides I need to know it too. How? He looked at her in a way that was direct, and also, she was learning this about him too, slightly searching, like a man checking whether the ground would hold before he put his full weight on it. I need someone I trust in town, he said, watching, listening. He paused. Someone who has reason to be in conversations I can't be in. A schoolteacher, Margaret said slowly. On the school board with Harlan Voss. His gray eyes were steady. Who he already thinks he can talk to comfortably. She looked at him for a moment. You want me to let him talk. I want you to let him think you're listening the way he expects you to listen. He held her gaze. Can you do that? The answer was yes, and they both knew it. She had spent 8 years managing the egos of frontier fathers who thought they knew more about their children's education than she did. Managing Harlan Voss's assumption of her compliance was not a fundamentally different skill. Yes, she said. But Cole, if he knows about the silver, then this marriage just became considerably more complicated than a practical arrangement. He said it without irony, and something about that, the simple directness of it, made her feel steadier rather than less. Were you not planning on telling me it might be dangerous? She asked. I didn't know until right now. She believed him. All right, she said. All right. He looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't fully read yet. She was still learning the geography of his face, the difference between his thinking silences and his troubled ones. Then he said, very quietly, Margaret. It was the first time he'd used her given name. She felt it like a change in air pressure. "Thank you for coming up here to tell me yourself." He paused. "You didn't have to do that." "I was going to marry you regardless," she said, slightly tartly. "It seemed relevant information." His mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile, but it was the neighborhood of one. And Danny, who had been very carefully not listening from the direction of the barn, let out a breath that was audible from 20 feet away. The wedding happened on a Monday. Reverend Aldrich performed it in the church with Ruth as witness, and Danny standing beside Cole in a clean shirt he was clearly uncomfortable in, his dark eyes tracking between the two adults with the careful attention of a boy trying to determine whether this was real. Margaret wore her green dress. She had 3 dresses worth noting: the gray for school, the green for occasions, and a blue that had seen better decades. She chose the green because it was the best of what she had, and because she was starting a marriage, not apologizing for one. Cole wore what appeared to be the same clothes as always, except cleaner and with his hat removed. He stood in the church with his shoulders square and his hands at his sides, and looked at her when she walked in with an expression that a less careful woman might have called struck. She chose not to call it anything yet. The vows were the standard ones. She had expected to feel the gap in them, the absence of love promised, and braced for it. But when Cole said, "I will," with that low, certain voice of his, looking at her directly rather than at the Reverend, she did not feel a gap. She felt something that didn't have a word yet, but wasn't nothing. When Reverend Aldridge said he could kiss the bride, Cole looked at her first, asking. She gave the smallest nod, and he bent down and pressed his lips briefly to her forehead, which was not what she'd expected, and was somehow more personal for it. Danny exhaled loudly from beside them. "That's it?" he said. "Daniel," Cole said. "I'm just saying it seemed like a lot of preparation for—" "Daniel." "Yes, sir?" Ruth Calloway, from the second pew, laughed so fully and freely that even Reverend Aldridge smiled. Harlan Voss attended the brief reception at Ruth's inn. He was charming. He was impeccably dressed. He kissed Margaret's hand and said all the right things about happiness and new beginnings and what an asset she would continue to be to the school, despite the change in her domestic circumstances. He shook Cole's hand with exactly the right amount of pressure and looked him in the eye and said he hoped the Hargrove property was thriving. Cole said it was. Voss said he'd heard rumors about the north pasture. Beautiful land, that ridge. Terrible waste to let it sit unused. Cole said he found it useful enough. Voss smiled. The smile that was exactly the right width. After he left, Margaret moved to stand beside her husband, that word still strange and real at the same time, and said very quietly, without looking at him, "He was measuring something." "Yes," Cole said, equally quiet. "He was." "He'll come to the school." "Probably. And when he does?" Cole turned his coffee cup in his hands. A slow rotation. She recognized it now. "Let him talk. Don't ask questions he'd notice. Just let him fill the silence." He paused. "You're good at that. At letting silence work." She considered this. "You notice that." "I notice most things." He set the cup down. "You go very still when you're listening to something important. Like you're afraid if you move, it'll stop talking." No one had ever told her that before. She wasn't sure how she felt about being seen that precisely by a man she'd known for less than 2 weeks. "Danny's watching us," she said, instead of responding. "He watches everything. Gets it from me." "It's not a criticism." "I know." He glanced at her. "He asked me last night if you'd be frightened, living on the mountain." What did you tell him? I told him the mountain isn't any more frightening than anything else. Just more honest about it. She looked at Danny across the room, holding the slice of Ruth's pie, with the dignity of a boy trying to look like he belonged in the celebration he desperately wanted to belong in. I'm going to need time with him, she said. Real time, not forced. I know. He's been without a woman in that house for 4 years. He won't trust easily. He trusted you in a schoolhouse after 90 minutes, Cole said. I'd say you're ahead of most. They rode up the mountain that evening, the 3 of them. Margaret had packed 2 trunks. Cole had tied them to the pack horse without comment and without any indication that 2 trunks were more or fewer than he'd expected, which she found obscurely reassuring. Halfway up the trail, Danny pulled his horse alongside hers. Miss Holt, if you're going to live in the same house as me, she said, you might consider something shorter. He thought about it. What do you want me to call you? It was a real question, offered with the kind of careful neutrality that cost him something to maintain. She understood what he was really asking. Not about words, about what this was. Whatever feels true when you say it, she said. Not before. He nodded, rode quietly for a minute. Then, my mother used to call me Daniel when she was proud of me, and Danny when she was regular. He paused. Uncle Cole calls me Daniel when he's about to say something serious, and Danny the rest. I heard him call you Daniel twice in one afternoon. He was serious twice, a ghost of a smile. That's normal. What was I calling you in school? Danny, always. Then Danny it stays, for now. She looked at him. And the rest? We'll figure it out. He looked straight ahead at the trail, but his shoulders dropped half an inch. She noticed, because she noticed things like that. Silences, and the shapes people's bodies made when they were finally putting something down. The ranch house was more than she'd expected, and different from what she'd imagined. Not large, 4 rooms and a loft, but solid in the way of things built to outlast their builder. There were books. That was the first thing she registered, and the first thing that recalibrated something in her chest. A whole shelf, mismatched and worn and clearly read. Your mother's? She said. Some mine. Cole set her smaller trunk inside the door. There's a desk in the bedroom. Good light in the morning. She walked to the bookshelf and ran one finger along the spines. Longfellow, a cracked copy of Whitman, 3 volumes of natural history, a Bible with a broken spine and pressed flowers inside that someone had placed there long ago and never removed. I brought Tennyson, she said. I know, I saw it in the trunk. You looked in my trunk? I lifted your trunk. He was entirely unrepentant. Tennyson is heavy. She turned around and he was standing in the center of the room, watching her with that steady gray attention, and she thought, suddenly and without preparation, that she was going to have to get used to being seen by this man, that there was no casual corner in him, that when he looked at her, he was actually looking. It was unsettling. It was also something she hadn't known she'd been hungry for. Show me the rest of the house, she said. He did. Danny appeared from the loft to provide editorial commentary that Cole bore with considerable patience, and by the time she had seen the kitchen and the loft and the small bedroom that would be hers for now, and the barn that was clearly Cole's true home, in spirit, if not in letter, the evening light was long and gold through the windows. Danny ate supper with the appetite of a boy who had fully recovered and was celebrating the fact. Cole ate with the economical focus of a man whose body understood food as fuel rather than pleasure. Margaret ate her biscuits and listened to Danny tell her about a hawk's nest on the North Trail and the particular way Cole could read weather in the way horses moved before a storm, and watched her husband across the table, not watching her watch him. After supper, Danny went to the loft. Cole built up the fire, not because it was cold, but because the evening required it. Margaret opened her journal at the desk in the corner, her own desk, positioned exactly as promised, and wrote 3 lines of something that wasn't quite a poem and wasn't quite a letter, and was probably both. She didn't realize Cole was still awake until he spoke. "I should tell you something," he said from his chair. She turned. His elbows were on his knees, and he was looking at the fire with an expression she was beginning to catalog as his serious face, the one that arrived before something that mattered. "I went to town this morning, before the wedding." He paused. "I stopped at the county records office, pulled the survey on my north pasture." She set down her pen. "The survey on file," he said, "is not the one my father filed in 1872. His voice was careful and very level. "The boundaries are different. Somebody changed the record." He looked up at her. "About 3 years ago." The fire popped. "The same time Ed Cass died," Margaret said. "Yes." She held his gaze across the room. This woman who had walked up a mountain with a yes in her chest and landed in something considerably larger than a practical arrangement. "Cole," she said, "we need to move carefully." "I know." "If Voss knows you've seen the survey—" "He doesn't know. Not yet." His jaw set. "But he'll find out eventually. Men like Voss have eyes in the county office, same as everywhere else." He looked at her steadily. "This is what I meant when I said it might get complicated. You might have mentioned it before the wedding." "I didn't know the extent of it before the wedding." She looked at him for a long moment. "Are you sorry you pulled me into this?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the fire, then back at her, and what she saw in his face was not apology. It was something older and more honest than that. "I'm sorry it exists," he said. "I'm not sorry you're here." She held that for a moment. Then she picked up her pen. "Tell me everything you know about Harlan Voss," she said. "From the beginning. Leave nothing out." Cole leaned back in his chair. In the loft above them, Danny shifted in his sleep and murmured something and went quiet. Outside, the summer night pressed in around the ranch house, vast and still. And Margaret Hargrove, opened a fresh page in her journal and began to write. The journal Margaret kept that first week on the mountain was not poetry. It was names, dates, and amounts. Everything Cole told her about Harlan Voss, organized in the precise methodical hand she used for attendance records and quarterly reports, broken down into the kind of clean columns that made patterns visible. She had taught arithmetic for 8 years. She understood that numbers lied less than people did, and that the lies numbers told were easier to find. By Thursday, she had 4 pages. By Saturday, she had a problem. "Cole," she set the journal on the kitchen table in front of him at breakfast. "Look at this column." He looked. His coffee cup stopped halfway to his mouth. "The survey was altered in March of 1888, she said. "Ed Cass died in September of 1887. That's 6 months between." She put her finger on the second column. "Voss filed the amended claim on the adjacent land in April of 1888. 1 month after the altered survey." She looked at him. "Somebody changed your boundary lines first. Then Voss moved on the adjacent claim, as if he already knew the new boundaries would hold." Cole set his cup down very carefully. "He had someone in the county office," Cole said. "He had someone in the county office before Ed Cass was cold," Margaret said. "This wasn't reactive. This was planned." She closed the journal. "Cole, this started before your father died." The silence that followed was the kind that changes the shape of a room. Danny had stopped eating. He was sitting absolutely still in the way he went still when something serious was happening. his dark eyes moving between them. "My father," Cole said, and his voice had a quality she hadn't heard in it before. Not anger yet, something that was going to become anger once it finished being grief. He had a dispute with Voss about water rights, 10 years ago, before I came back from the army. How did it end? My father backed down. Cole's jaw worked. He told me Voss had offered him a fair settlement, that it wasn't worth the fight. He looked at the journal. My father never backed down from anything in his life. Margaret let that sit for exactly the right amount of time. He was pressured, she said, or threatened. Cole pushed back from the table and stood up, because he was a man who could not hold a certain kind of emotion sitting down. And I came home from the army and never asked the right questions because I was 23 and grieving and too busy trying to hold the ranch together to look at anything sideways. You couldn't have known. I should have asked. Cole. She said his name firmly enough to stop him moving. You were 23 years old, and your father had just compromised a decade of work for what looked like a reasonable settlement. There was nothing to ask. She held his gaze. But there is now. He looked at her across the table, and she saw the moment the grief finished becoming what it was going to become. What do you need? He said. I need to talk to someone in the county records office. Someone who was there in 1888. She paused. Someone who might remember an amendment being filed and might be willing to say so. Voss owns half the county officials. He doesn't own all of them. She thought of Ruth, who had survived 11 years in Copper Falls by knowing which people hadn't been bought yet. I know where to start. She rode down the mountain alone on Monday morning. Cole had not liked it. He hadn't said so in those words. He wasn't a man who translated discomfort into prohibition. But she had felt the restraint it cost him, the effort of standing at the top of the trail and watching her go without following. She had looked back once. He was still standing there, hat in his hands, turning it in that slow rotation she now knew meant he was holding something he didn't have language for yet. She rode faster. Ruth was behind the inn counter when Margaret walked in, and Ruth took one look at her face and poured 2 cups of coffee before Margaret had said a single word. Tell me, Ruth said. Margaret told her. All of it. The journal, the dates, the columns, the water rights dispute 10 years ago. Ruth listened the same way Cole listened, with her whole attention, nothing held back for another purpose. When Margaret finished, Ruth was quiet for a moment. Tom Briggs, she said. The feed store man? He was a clerk in the county office from 1885 to 1890. Left when Voss started consolidating the commercial lots and Tom's family lost their building. Ruth's eyes were steady. He's been quietly furious about Harlan Voss for 15 years, and he's never had anything concrete enough to say. She paused. He might talk to you. Why me specifically? Because you're Cole Hargrove's wife, and Cole Hargrove just became Voss's problem. Ruth picked up her cup. Tom Briggs has been waiting for someone to become Voss's problem for a long time. Tom Briggs talked. He talked for 45 minutes in the back room of his feed store with the door closed and his hands wrapped around a coffee mug so tightly his knuckles went white. And what he said made Margaret's blood run cold, and her handwriting go very small and precise in her journal. He remembered the survey amendment. March of 1888, exactly as the record showed. He remembered because the man who filed it had come in after closing time, which was irregular. And the county recorder, a man named Abbott, who had retired abruptly to Kansas 6 months later, had processed it without the standard witness requirement. I asked Abbott about it the next morning, Tom said. He told me it was a clerical correction, a boundary error from the original 1872 filing. His jaw tightened. I'd processed the 1872 filing myself. There was no error. Did you say so? I said so to Abbott. Tom set down his cup. 2 days later, Voss came into the office to discuss the commercial lot renewals. He was very pleasant. He mentioned, in passing, that he'd heard my youngest daughter was hoping to attend the women's college in Denver. A pause. And that, unfortunately, the scholarship fund he'd been considering supporting had just encountered some budgetary constraints. Margaret held her pen still. She didn't go to Denver, Tom said flatly. I stopped asking questions. Tom, Margaret looked at him directly. Would you put this in writing? The silence stretched long enough that she heard the minecarts 2 streets over. If I put it in writing, Tom said carefully, Harlan Voss will know. Yes. He'll move against the feed store. Against my family. Probably. She didn't soften it. He deserved the truth. But if you don't, Cole Hargrove loses his land, and whatever's under that north pasture makes Voss powerful enough that the next person he moves against won't have anyone left to go to. Tom Briggs looked at her for a long moment. You've been here 8 years, he said. You know this town. I know this town. Then you know that Harlan Voss has never lost. He's never had anyone willing to fight him with evidence instead of anger, she said. Angry men make mistakes he can use. Careful ones are harder to stop. Tom picked up his coffee, set it down, picked it up again. Give me until Wednesday, he said. She was halfway back up the mountain trail when the horse slowed, and she realized she wasn't alone on the path. Harlan Voss sat on a gray mare 20 feet ahead of her, blocking the trail with the casual ease of a man who had never needed to hurry anything in his life. Mrs. Hargrove. His smile was exactly the right width. What a pleasant coincidence. It was not a coincidence, and they both knew it. Mr. Voss? She kept her voice level and her hands relaxed on the reins, because the horse would read her nerves if she let them show, and she would not let them show. Heading up the ridge? Just riding. He turned his horse alongside hers, falling into step. Companionable. Terrible. I heard you were in town. I thought I might catch you before you made the climb. He paused. I heard you stopped by the feed store. Her heart moved precisely once, in a way she did not allow to register on her face. I needed grain, she said. Tom Briggs was seen walking you to the back room. His voice was pleasant and informational and entirely menacing. That's an unusual level of service for a grain purchase. He was showing me a new catalog. She looked at him with the direct patience she used on parents who thought they were cleverer than she was. I'm setting up a kitchen garden on the ridge. I had questions about soil amendments. Voss looked at her for a moment. His calculating eyes did their calculation. I like you, Margaret, he said. I want you to know that. I respected your independence when you were teaching alone in this town. I respect your choice to marry, even if... A pause, fractional and deliberate. Even if the match surprised some people. It surprised me, she said honestly. Cole Hargrove is a hard man, an isolated one. Voss's voice was gentle, concerned, the voice of a man who had practiced concern the way other men practiced shooting. He has a property dispute pending that could become quite difficult. I'd hate to see you caught up in something unpleasant so early in a marriage. That's very kind. I could make it go away. He said it simply, as if he were offering to hold a door. The survey question, the adjacent claim, all of it. If Cole were willing to discuss a reasonable arrangement regarding the north pasture, grazing rights perhaps, some shared access. He looked at her. Men on opposite sides of a legal dispute can end up destroying each other when a straightforward conversation could have settled things in an afternoon. She looked at the trail ahead and thought about Tom Briggs's daughter, who didn't go to Denver, and Ed Cass, who died of a riding accident 6 weeks after finding silver, and the flowers pressed in a Bible on Cole's bookshelf that had belonged to a woman who made compromises and then went quiet. "I'll speak to Cole," she said. "Wonderful." His smile widened to precisely the right degree. "I'm sure a woman of your intelligence can help him see the wisdom of it." He turned his horse back down the trail and rode away, and Margaret sat still on her borrowed horse until the sound of his hooves faded completely. Then she opened her journal and wrote down every word of the conversation from memory before she could lose a syllable. Cole read it twice. He stood in the kitchen and read it twice without speaking, and when he looked up, the expression on his face was one she had not seen before. Not the grief becoming anger, something colder and more settled than that. "He followed you," Cole said. "He had someone watching the town, watching me." She kept her voice steady. "He knows I went to Briggs." "Does he know what Briggs said?" "I don't think so. Not yet." She sat down at the table. "But Cole, if Briggs agrees to put it in writing, Voss will know before the ink dries." Cole set the journal down. "He has eyes in the county office. He's had them for years." "Then we can't use the county office." She looked at him. "We need to go to the territorial authorities, directly. Bypass the local records entirely." "That's a 2-day ride to Cheyenne." "I know." "And if Voss finds out we've gone to Cheyenne before we get there?" "Then we don't tell anyone we're going." She held his gaze. "Cole, he offered you a way out this afternoon. Grazing rights, shared access. He's being careful because he's not sure how much I know." She paused. "We have a window, a short one." Cole was quiet for a moment. In the loft above them, Danny was working on the arithmetic problem she'd left him. She could hear the faint scratch of his pencil, the occasional frustrated sigh that was so exactly like his uncle it made her chest ache. "I'm not leaving Danny on the mountain alone," Cole said. "No." She had already thought about this. "He comes with us." A 2-day ride to Cheyenne with a boy whose leg is 2 weeks healed? "His leg is fine. He told me himself, and he's not a child who overstates his condition." She looked at Cole directly. "He'll be safer with us than here. If Voss decides to move, the ranch is the first place he'll go." Cole's jaw tightened. "Danny!" He raised his voice toward the loft. The pencil stopped. "Yes, sir?" "How's the leg?" A pause that was clearly the sound of a boy deciding how honest to be. "Fine enough." "Fine enough for a long ride?" A longer pause. Then, "Are we going somewhere?" "Answer the question." "Yes, sir. Fine enough." Cole looked at Margaret. Something in his face settled, the way things settle when a man has made a decision he's going to live with completely. "Wednesday morning," he said, "before light." Tuesday night, Harlan Voss came to the ranch. He didn't come himself. He sent a man named Chester Doyle, who worked the Silver Crown security detail and had the kind of face that suggested violence was a professional activity rather than an emotional one. Chester Doyle knocked on the ranch door at 9 in the evening with a folded letter in his hand and nothing friendly in his posture. Cole opened the door and looked at him for one long moment. "Mr. Voss sends his compliments," Chester said, and held out the letter. Cole took it without touching the man's hand and stepped back from the door. He didn't invite Chester in. Chester didn't seem to expect it. Margaret read the letter over Cole's shoulder. It was politely written in the precise hand of a man who chose every word like a chess piece. And it said, in its carefully worded essence, that Harlan Voss had conducted a thorough review of the Hargrove property survey and found significant irregularities that would require the north pasture to be vacated within 30 days, pending a territorial review. Unless, of course, the matter could be settled privately, in the spirit of neighborly cooperation. At the bottom, in a postscript that was almost casual in its precision, Voss had written, "I understand your wife has been consulting with local residents about historical county records. I would gently encourage her to focus her considerable intelligence on her new domestic responsibilities. Copper Falls is a small town. Misunderstandings about the past can cause considerable present distress for those one cares about." Danny, who had come down from the loft and was reading over Margaret's other shoulder, made a sound that was not entirely appropriate for a 13-year-old. "Daniel," Cole said. "He threatened her," Danny said, and his voice had a quality in it that was very much his uncle's. "He's threatening Margaret." "I'm aware." "Then why are we standing here?" "Because we're not giving him what he wants, which is for us to do something he can use." Cole folded the letter. "We're leaving before sunrise. Both of you pack what you need for 3 days. Nothing extra." Chester Doyle was still on the porch. Cole stepped outside and pulled the door mostly closed behind him. Margaret heard Cole's voice, low and deliberate, and Chester Doyle's briefer responses. Then footsteps down the porch steps and away. Cole came back inside. "What did you tell him?" Margaret asked. "I told him to tell Voss that I'd read the letter and was giving it serious consideration." His face was completely level. "That'll buy us until noon tomorrow before Voss starts wondering." "That's not much window." "No." He looked at her. "But it's enough." Danny was already on the stairs to the loft, moving with the quiet efficiency of a boy who had grown up on a mountain and understood that preparation was not something you did slowly. Margaret went to her desk and picked up the journal. 4 pages of names, dates, and amounts. Tom Briggs's testimony, not yet in writing, but lodged in her memory with the clarity of something she'd reviewed 100 times. The letter from Voss, which she folded into the journal's back cover. She looked around the room. The books on the shelf, the Bible with the pressed flowers, the cradle Cole had been building in the barn for reasons he hadn't explained yet, and felt something firm up in her chest. This was her house. This was her mountain, and Harlan Voss had made the precise mistake that Harlan Voss had apparently always made. The mistake that powerful men who thought in terms of acquisition always made. He had assumed that the people between him and what he wanted were obstacles. He had not considered that they might be something else entirely. She snapped the journal shut and went to pack. They were on the trail before 4 in the morning, the summer dark still full overhead, the 3 horses moving quietly down the mountain in a line. Cole first, then Danny, then Margaret at the rear, with the pack horse's lead in her left hand and her journal in her right saddlebag. Danny rode without complaint, his posture steady despite the early hour and the healed leg that was probably less fine than he'd claimed. He didn't ask where they were going, which suggested he'd worked it out for himself. Halfway down the mountain, Cole slowed his horse and fell back alongside Margaret. He didn't say anything for a moment. They rode in the particular silence of 2 people who had become, in the space of 10 days, the kind of company each other sought, rather than endured. "When this is over," he said finally. She waited. "When this is settled and done." He kept his eyes on the trail. "I want to ask you something I didn't ask before the wedding, because I didn't know how." She looked at the side of his face in the dark. The scar, the jaw, the line of his hat brim against the sky. "All right," she said. "I want to ask if you're staying." He said it without looking at her, which told her it cost him considerably. Not because of the practical arrangement, not because of Danny, though God knows he needs you. A pause. Whether you want to stay, on the mountain, with me. The trail was dark, and the horses were quiet, and somewhere below them, Copper Falls was sleeping, unaware of what was coming down out of the ridge toward it. Margaret thought about a journal full of poems no one had ever read. She thought about Gerald Whitmore and her mother, who nodded. She thought about 8 years of a residence that held only her own breathing. She thought about a man turning his hat in his hands in a dark kitchen and saying, "I forgot what it felt like. I'd like to remember." "Ask me when it's over," she said, "so you know the answer is free." Cole was quiet for a moment. Then, "Fair enough." Danny's voice drifted back from ahead of them on the trail. "For the record," he said, with the tone of a boy who had absolutely been listening, "I already know her answer." "Daniel," Cole said, "I'm just saying. I know what you're saying. She's been here 11 days, and she reorganized the kitchen, and she reads to herself when she thinks nobody's listening, and she argued with you twice and didn't back down either time." Danny's voice was matter-of-fact and entirely certain. "That's not someone who's leaving." The silence that followed was the best kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Cole reached across the gap between their horses and took Margaret's hand without looking at her, briefly, the way you'd steady something you were afraid of dropping. Then he let go and looked back at the trail, and Margaret looked at the road ahead, and they rode down out of the mountain toward Cheyenne with a forged survey and a dead man's testimony, and everything worth fighting for, packed neatly into 3 days' worth of saddlebags. Behind them on the ridge, the Silver Crown mine began its morning shift, and Harlan Voss, who had never lost, had no idea what was coming. They arrived in Cheyenne on the second evening with dust on their clothes and nothing soft left in any of their bodies. Danny had not complained once, not when his legs stiffened on the second afternoon, not when the trail went rough through the lower canyon, not when they camped on hard ground with nothing but trail biscuits and Cole's silence for company. He had simply ridden and slept and ridden again, with the patient endurance of a boy who understood that some things required you to be smaller than the discomfort. Margaret had watched him and thought about what it cost a child to learn that early. The territorial office sat on a wide street that smelled of horses and ambition, a solid brick building that looked like it had been placed there deliberately to remind people that authority existed, even out here. Cole tied the horses and stood looking at the door for exactly 3 seconds. Not hesitating, she'd learned the difference. Just measuring. "You ready?" she said. "Been ready since March of 1888, he said, and pushed the door open. The clerk inside was a young man named Peters, with ink on his fingers, and the expression of someone who had processed too many claims from too many hard-faced men to be surprised by any of them anymore. He looked at Cole's size and registered nothing. He looked at Margaret's journal and registered slightly more. "We need to speak with the territorial land inspector," Margaret said. "Not a deputy. The inspector himself." "Inspector Garrett is available," she said. "I'd imagine. For a matter involving a forged county survey, a falsified property claim, and a probable connection to a suspicious death 3 years ago." She set the journal on his desk and opened it to the first page of columns. "I've been a schoolteacher for 8 years, Mr. Peters. I know what organized evidence looks like, and I know what it doesn't look like. What I have here looks like something your inspector will want to see before it goes anywhere else." Peters looked at the journal, then at Cole, then back at the journal. "I'll see if he's available," he said. Inspector Garrett was a compact man in his 50s, with a careful face, and eyes that had spent a long time watching people decide whether to tell the truth. He read every page of Margaret's journal without speaking. He asked 3 questions, each one precise enough that she knew he'd understood the implications before he asked them. Then he sat back in his chair and looked at Cole. "You've been sitting on this land for how long?" 15 years. My father before me for 12. "And the survey alteration happened?" March 1888. I pulled the record last week. The amendment is on file under Recorder Abbott's name. No witness signature, non-standard filing time. Cole's voice was level. Abbott retired to Kansas 6 months later. Voss filed the adjacent claim 1 month after the amendment. Garrett looked at the journal again. This is organized. My wife organized it, Cole said, and the simple directness of it, no qualification, no apology for the source, made something warm move through Margaret's chest, even in the middle of all of it. I need a formal statement, Garrett said. From you, from your wife, and from this Tom Briggs. He paused. Briggs hasn't signed anything yet. He's waiting on Wednesday, Margaret said. We left yesterday before dawn. You left without telling him you were coming here? We left without telling anyone. She held the inspector's gaze. Harlan Voss has people watching Copper Falls. If we'd told Briggs we were going to the territorial office, Voss would have known before we crossed the county line. Garrett was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man who had learned to read situations sideways rather than straight on. Voss has been on our radar for some time, he said carefully. Cole went very still beside her. What does that mean? Margaret asked. It means you are not the first people to walk into this office with concerns about Harlan Voss and his land practices. Garrett closed the journal and slid it back across the desk. It means that 3 previous complaints have been filed, and 3 previous complaints have been withdrawn before they reached formal review. The room was quiet. Withdrawn by the complainants? Margaret asked. Withdrawn by the complainants, Garrett confirmed, under circumstances that were not fully explained. 2 of those complainants subsequently left the territory. One of them is still in Copper Falls. He paused. Running a feed store. Tom Briggs. The name landed like a stone in still water. He withdrew a previous complaint, Margaret said slowly. 7 years ago. Before your time in Copper Falls, Mrs. Hargrove. Garrett looked at her steadily. He came in here with documentation about a water rights dispute involving Voss and a rancher named Hargrove. A pause that had weight in it. Cole Hargrove's father. The air in the room changed. Cole leaned forward in his chair. My father. Your father filed a complaint about Voss's water rights claim in the spring of 1885. Briggs came as a supporting witness. Garrett's voice was careful and deliberate. The complaint was withdrawn 2 weeks later. Your father withdrew it himself. He looked at Cole directly. 6 months after that, your father settled the water rights dispute in Voss's favor and never filed another complaint about anything. Cole's hands were flat on his knees. She could see the tension in them from where she sat. And then my father died, Cole said. 3 years later, yes. Of a heart attack. Cole's voice was doing the flat thing again. The thing that was past anger and into something colder. At 42, alone in the north pasture. There was no inquest, Garrett said. The death was recorded as natural causes. He paused. I want you to understand that I am telling you this because you have brought me more documented evidence than anyone else has managed. And because if you walk out of this office and go back to Copper Falls, before I have your formal statements on record, whatever happens next will be very difficult to address legally. What are you saying? Margaret asked. I'm saying Voss will know you came here. Possibly already does. Garrett stood up and went to the door. I'm saying I need your statements today, not Wednesday, not after you've ridden back and confirmed with Briggs. Today. He looked at Cole. And I'm saying that if Voss has been running this operation for 20 years, he has contingency plans for exactly this situation. He opened the door and spoke to Peters in the outer room. Get me 2 statement forms and the Copper Falls land file. Then he turned back to them. Mr. Hargrove, is there anyone in Copper Falls who Voss might move against if he learned you'd come here? Cole and Margaret looked at each other at exactly the same moment. Ruth. Danny was waiting outside with the horses, sitting on a hitching rail eating an apple with the studied patience of a boy who had been told to stay put and was doing so at considerable personal cost. He looked up when they came out and read their faces in the way he always read faces, quickly, accurately, without commentary, until he knew what commentary was warranted. "Bad?" he said. "Complicated," Margaret said. "Are we going back?" "Yes." Cole was already checking the horse's rigging. "As soon as we're done in there." "How long?" 2 hours, Cole looked at him. "Maybe 3. Danny finished his apple and said nothing else, which was the most useful thing he could have done, and he knew it. They gave their statements in 90 minutes. Margaret's was 7 pages because she wrote the way she thought, completely, in order, with nothing assumed. Cole's was 3 pages because he said exactly what had happened and stopped when it was said. Both of them signed at the bottom in front of Garrett and 2 witnesses. Garrett filed them on the spot. "This initiates a formal territorial review," he said. "Voss cannot legally move on the North Pasture while the review is active. I'll send notice to the Copper Falls Sheriff by wire today." "Does the sheriff work for Voss?" Cole asked. A pause. "Sheriff Alderman has had his own concerns about Voss for some time," Garrett said carefully. "I believe he'll act appropriately when served with official notice." "Believe," Cole repeated. "It's the best I can give you right now." Cole stood up and put on his hat. "What about my father?" The question sat in the room like something with real weight. Garrett looked at him steadily. "The water rights complaint your father withdrew in 1885. I'm going to pull the original documentation. If Voss applied the same kind of pressure to withdraw it that he applied to alter your survey, there may be grounds for a broader investigation." He paused. "That takes time. I'm not going to promise you something I can't deliver." "I'm not asking for promises," Cole said. "I'm asking for honesty." "Then, honestly, if what you've brought me holds up, and I believe it will, Harlan Voss is going to have a very bad autumn." Garrett held his gaze. "Your father's name will be part of that. I'll make sure of it." Cole nodded once. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was the particular acknowledgement of a man receiving something he'd waited a long time for, and was still deciding how to carry. Margaret put her hand on his arm, briefly. He put his hand over hers, briefly. Then they went outside to get Danny, and rode. They made Copper Falls in a day and a half. Cole pushed the pace harder than he should have, and Margaret matched it without complaint, and Danny matched it without complaint. And none of them talked about why they were riding like something was on fire, because they all understood why. And talking about it wouldn't change the horse's legs. They hit the edge of town in the late afternoon. Cole pulled up short on the main street. Margaret pulled up alongside him. The inn's front window was dark. Ruth Calloway's inn was never dark before 9 in the evening. It had not been dark before 9 in the evening in the 11 years Ruth had run it, because Ruth Calloway treated her establishment like a living thing that required constant tending, and the front window light was the first thing she lit in the morning and the last thing she dimmed at night. It was barely past 5. Cole was off his horse before Margaret fully registered what she was seeing. She swung down behind him, caught Danny's reins automatically. "Stay," she said, and he did, because he saw the window too. Cole went through the inn door like a man walking through something he expected to need to break. Margaret was 3 steps behind him. Ruth Calloway was sitting at her own bar counter with a cloth wrapped around her left hand, and Clara Webb, Margaret's student, the miner's daughter, 11 years old, sitting beside her, holding the cloth in place with the focused concentration of a child doing the most important thing she has ever been asked to do. "Ruth!" Margaret was at the counter in 4 steps. "What happened?" "Chester Doyle happened." Ruth's voice was steady, which told Margaret more about her character than anything she'd observed in 8 years. "He came in this morning with 2 others, looking for anything that might connect to county records or correspondence about land surveys." Her eyes went to Cole. "They tore the back room apart." "I told them there was nothing to find." "And the hand?" "I may have communicated that opinion more physically than verbally." Ruth's chin went up fractionally. "The doorframe made a better point than I did." Cole was already moving toward the back room. Margaret heard him stop in the doorway. "Bad?" she called. "Thorough," he said, which meant bad. Clara looked up at Margaret with dark, serious eyes. "Miss Holt." Her voice had the particular quality of a child who has been frightened and has not yet decided if it's acceptable to show it. "Are you going to be all right?" Margaret sat down on the stool beside her and took the cloth over from her small hands, checking the wound. A deep gash across Ruth's palm, already cleaned, not as serious as the blood had made it look. "Yes," she said, and meant it in the particular way of someone who has just spent 36 hours on horseback carrying evidence to the territorial office and come home to find the fight moved to their own doorstep. "We're going to be fine." She looked at Ruth. "Tom Briggs, have you seen him today?" "Not since yesterday morning." Ruth's eyes sharpened. "Should I be concerned?" "I don't know yet." Margaret pressed the cloth firm. "Cole." He came back to the doorway. "Tom Briggs," she said. Cole was out the door before she finished the sentence. Tom Briggs was in his feed store with the shutters drawn and a rifle across his knees that he'd apparently been holding since sometime that morning, judging by the set of his shoulders and the quality of his relief when Cole knocked and identified himself. He opened the door and looked at Cole, then past him at Margaret, then at the empty street behind them. "Get in," he said, "quickly." The rifle didn't leave his hands until the door was closed behind all 3 of them. Danny had appeared from somewhere. She hadn't told him to stay, and of course he hadn't. And Briggs looked at the boy and made a fast calculation, and apparently decided that anyone Cole Hargrove brought through his door was acceptable. "Doyle came here this morning," Tom said. His voice was doing something careful that was trying not to be afraid. "2 men with him. They didn't touch anything. They didn't need to. Doyle just stood there in the middle of my store and asked how my eldest daughter was doing, whether she was happy in Copper Falls, whether she'd been thinking about moving elsewhere." He set the rifle down on the counter because his hands were shaking enough that holding it was becoming counterproductive. "My daughter is 16 years old." The air in the room went very still. "The same message he sent me," Margaret said quietly. "He knows you went to Cheyenne." Tom looked at Cole. "How does he know already?" "Because he's been watching us since Tuesday night," Cole said. "He had someone on the trail." His jaw worked. "I should have varied the route." "You couldn't have known he'd move this fast." "I knew he was the kind of man who moves fast when he's cornered." Cole looked at Briggs directly. "Tom, I need you to do something that's going to be difficult." Briggs laughed, which was not a happy sound. "More difficult than this morning?" "I need your formal statement, written, signed, witnessed." Cole held his gaze. "Today." "Cole, the territorial inspector filed our statements this morning. The review is officially open. Boss cannot legally touch the north pasture while it's active, and he knows it." He paused. "Which means the only way he stops this now is to make the witnesses disappear. And the only way he can't make the witnesses disappear is if their statements are already on official record." Another pause. "Your statement is the one that puts his forgery in context. Without it, we have circumstantial evidence and a surveyor's record. With it, we have a 20-year fraud with a witness who was there." Tom was quiet for a long moment. "And my daughter," he said. "Comes to the ranch," Margaret said. Tom looked at her. "Tonight. Both your children and your wife, if she's willing. The mountain is not comfortable, but it is defensible, and Voss's hired men don't know it the way Cole does." She held the older man's gaze. "Tom, he's going to come for you regardless. The question is whether he does it before or after your statement is on record." She paused. "Make it after." Tom Briggs looked at the rifle on his counter, then at his hands, then at Cole. "You got paper?" he said. They were back at Ruth's Inn an hour later, with Tom Briggs's signed statement folded into Margaret's journal. Ruth had lit the window lamp. Clara had gone home to her father. Danny was eating bread at the bar, with the appetite of a boy who had decided the crisis was sufficiently under control to permit food. Cole stood at the window, not quite visible from the street, watching the road with the flat attention of a man who had learned on a mountain that the thing that killed you was rarely the thing you'd seen coming. Margaret sat at the bar and wrote a letter. She wrote it to Inspector Garrett in Cheyenne, detailing the morning's events at the inn and the feed store, Chester Doyle, the intimidation, the timing, and enclosed Tom Briggs's signed statement with a note that it was being sent under separate cover with Ruth Calloway as custodial witness. "Cole," she looked up, "I need someone to ride to the telegraph office tonight." "I'll go," Danny said immediately. "You'll stay," Cole said, not looking away from the window. "I'm faster than you'll stay." The tone was not negotiable. Cole finally turned from the window. "I'll go." He looked at Ruth. "Are you willing to hold the statement overnight?" "I've been holding things for this town for 11 years, Ruth said dryly. "One more document won't break me." Cole crossed to the bar and picked up the sealed letter Margaret had finished, and looked at her for a moment. "When I get back," he said quietly, "I want to talk about the ranch." "The ranch or something else?" "Something else," he said. "Something I started to say on the mountain and didn't finish." Margaret looked at him. This man she had married 10 days ago with practical words and no promises, who had ridden 2 days to Cheyenne and back, and was still standing in a Copper Falls bar at 7 in the evening, with legal evidence in one hand and something unspoken in his face that he was clearly working up to. "I'll be here," she said. He held her gaze for one long moment. Then he put on his hat and walked out. Danny watched the door close and turned to Margaret. "He's going to tell you," Danny said. "Tell me what?" "That he's been in love with you since about the second day." He said it with the matter-of-fact certainty of someone reporting observable conditions. He just needs to get the legal crisis sufficiently resolved before he can say it without it sounding like he's saying it because of the legal crisis. Margaret looked at him. "I'm 13, Danny said, "not blind." Ruth made a sound that was definitely a laugh converted at the last moment into a cough. "Finish your bread," Margaret said. Cole was gone 40 minutes. He came back with the telegram receipt in his hand and someone else's urgency in his stride. And Margaret knew before he spoke that something had shifted. "Garrett wired back already," he said. He laid the telegram on the bar. "Voss sent a representative to the territorial office this afternoon, 2 hours after we left." Margaret read the telegram, then read it again. Garrett's message was precise and careful, and delivered a fact that rearranged everything she thought she understood about the shape of this fight. Voss's representative had presented a counterfiling, a deed to the Hargrove North pasture dated 1871. 1 year before Cole's father had filed his original claim. Signed, witnessed, and stamped with a notary seal from a firm in Denver that had subsequently gone out of business in 1882. "Another forgery," Margaret said. "A better one." Cole's voice was flat. "Older paper, professional work. Not the practice copy you found in a church library, Margaret. This was prepared years ago and held until it was needed." "He had a contingency." She set the telegram down. "He always had a contingency. He watched my father back down in 1885. He watched me come home from the army and run horses and not ask questions. He had 20 years to prepare for the day someone came at him with evidence." Cole looked at the telegram. He prepared. The bar was very quiet. Danny had stopped eating. "Garrett suspending the review?" Margaret asked. "Pending verification of the counter-filing." Cole's jaw worked. 3 days, he says. He needs 3 days to authenticate the deed. He looked at her. "Voss knows we've filed. He knows we're here. He knows we have Briggs's statement. And now he has 3 days while the review is frozen." "What does he do with 3 days?" "He makes the evidence go away." Cole looked at her directly. "Or he makes the people holding it go away." Ruth put her hand flat on the bar. "Then you don't stay in Copper Falls." "I'm not running from my own town," Cole said. "I'm not suggesting running. I'm suggesting not making yourself an easy target while Garrett verifies the deed." She looked at Cole steadily. "You go back up the mountain. Tonight. You take Margaret, you take Danny, you take Briggs and this family if they'll come." She paused. "You let me handle Copper Falls for 3 days." "Ruth," Cole Hargrove. Her voice was exactly as firm as it needed to be. "I have been in this town for 11 years, and I have outlasted 6 of Voss's business arrangements and 1 of his sheriffs, and I am not frightened of Chester Doyle." She held his gaze. "Go up the mountain. I know every person in this county who has something to say about Harlan Voss and hasn't said it yet. Give me 3 days, and I'll have half of them ready to walk into Garrett's office the moment the review reopens." The silence stretched. Cole looked at Margaret. She looked back at him and thought about a woman who had ridden a mountain horse alone for 2 hours on a Thursday morning to say yes to a man who turned his hat in his hands. She thought about what Ruth had said the first day. He has never looked at a person like they were something to be acquired. She thought about 3 days on a mountain with her husband and her almost son, and a fight that was almost won. "Ruth's right," she said. "We go up." Cole looked at Ruth for a long moment. 3 days, he said. 3 days, Ruth said. "Go." They left before the hour was out. Tom Briggs had agreed to come, his wife and children loaded into the wagon with the speed of a family that had been half-packed since morning. They moved up the mountain trail in a quiet line, with the stars overhead and the town below going about its night business, unaware that the ground beneath Harlan Voss's 30-year empire was finally cracking. An hour up the trail, Danny pulled his horse alongside Cole and rode in silence for a minute. "Uncle Cole?" "Yeah?" "Ed Cass." Danny's voice was careful. "The miner who died. He found the silver under our land, right? That's what all of this is about?" "That's what it's about." "So it's been there the whole time, under our pasture, while we were running horses?" "Yes." Danny was quiet for a moment. "Are we going to mine it?" "No." "No?" "I run horses," Cole said simply. "Always have. The silver can stay in the ground." He looked at his nephew. "Some things are worth more than what's under them." Danny thought about this. "But it's evidence," Margaret said from behind them both. "That silver vein is the reason for everything Voss has done. Once Garrett authenticates his deed as a forgery, the question of what's actually under that land becomes part of the legal record. I know, Cole said. Which means you're going to have surveyors up here regardless. I know. And the territorial government may have claims, Margaret. His voice was patient and certain. I know. We'll handle it when it comes. He looked back at her over his shoulder, and even in the dark, she could see the expression on his face. The one she had been learning the geography of. The one that was his serious face, but with something warmer underneath it. First we handle Voss. Then we handle whatever's under the ground. A pause. Then I finish what I started saying on the mountain. Margaret held that for a moment.
You remember where you stopped? She said.
I remember exactly where I stopped. Danny made a strangled sound and looked very hard at the trail ahead. The mountain rose around them, vast and dark, and theirs. And below, in Copper Falls, Ruth Calloway lit her lamp and started making a list of names. The 3 days on the mountain were the longest of Margaret's life, and also, unexpectedly, the most clarifying. Tom Briggs's wife turned out to be a woman named Helen, who had strong opinions about biscuit ratios, and said almost nothing else for the first 24 hours, which Margaret found entirely reasonable given the circumstances. Their 2 children, a boy of 10 and the 16-year-old daughter Voss had referenced by Mame, slept in the loft with Danny and moved through the ranch house with the careful quietness of people trying not to take up more space than they'd been offered. Danny showed the Briggs boy the north pasture on the second morning.
Margaret watched them from the kitchen window, not describing what she saw, just registering the sound of 2 boys talking about horses and hawks and the particular way the mountain changed color before a storm. The sound of ordinary childhood continuing despite everything trying to interrupt it. Cole came in and stood beside her. He's good with him, Margaret said. He's been alone up here too long. Cole poured his coffee. He needed someone to show things to. He shows things to me. That's different. Cole looked at her. He shows you things because he wants you to understand them. He shows that boy because he wants someone to share them. A pause. Both matter. They're just different. She looked at him. When did you get so precise about human nature? You spend enough years alone on a mountain, you get precise about the things you're missing. He set his cup down. Margaret, the particular quality in his voice, careful, deliberate. The voice he used when something mattered enough to choose every word, made her turn fully toward him. I started saying something on the trail down, he said. And then the telegram happened, and I filed it away because I'm a man who needs situations to be sufficiently resolved before he can say things correctly. He looked at her with those gray eyes that she had been learning for 3 weeks now, and still felt like she was only reading the first chapter of. The situation is not yet resolved, but I've decided I'm done waiting for it to be. She folded her hands. Old habit. Say it then. I love you. He said it the way he said everything that was true. Directly, without decoration, without apology for the simplicity of it. Not because of what you did in Cheyenne, or how you handled Voss on the trail, or because you got Briggs's statement signed. Before all of that. He paused. When you sat with Danny in that schoolhouse chair after he fell asleep, and you thought nobody was watching, you had a look on your face like a woman who had just been handed something she'd forgotten she was allowed to want. He held her gaze. I've been in love with that look since the second day. The kitchen was very quiet. Danny had been right then. Danny, who was 13 years old and not blind. Cole, she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt, which was the final proof that 8 years of frontier teaching had built something in her that held even when she needed it to. I have been in love with you since you taught me to shoot and told me I was a natural, and then spent the entire walk back to the house looking like you were terrified I'd be in danger. She paused. which I found both alarming and completely irresistible. His mouth moved. This time it completed the journey to an actual smile. The full version, not the neighborhood of one. And it changed his entire face so thoroughly that she understood with sudden clarity why he didn't deploy it often. It would have been distracting. He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides, took her face in both hands with that gentleness that still astonished her, given the size of them, and kissed her properly for the first time. Outside, from the direction of the north pasture, Danny Hargrove's voice carried clearly on the mountain air. "Finally," he said. Ruth's wire came on the afternoon of the 3rd day. Cole read it twice, the way he read everything that mattered, and then handed it to Margaret without comment. Ruth had not wasted words. She never did. Garrett authenticated deed as forgery. Denver notary firm dissolved under fraud investigation 1882. Voss used defunct firm intentionally. 6 witnesses signed statements in Copper Falls office yesterday, including Sheriff Alderman. Chester Doyle in custody. Voss summoned to territorial office Friday morning. Come down. Margaret read it and felt something release in her chest that had been coiled there since Tuesday night. "It's done?" Tom Briggs asked from the doorway. He had heard them moving and appeared with Helen behind him, and the particular expression of a man who had been waiting for news since morning. "Almost," Cole said. "Friday." "Friday," Tom repeated. He sat down at the kitchen table, like his legs had made a decision without consulting him. Helen put her hand on his shoulder. He put his over hers. They stayed that way for a moment, not saying anything, which said everything. Danny appeared at the loft stairs. "Are we going down?" "Tomorrow morning," Cole said. "Good." Danny disappeared back up the stairs, then reappeared immediately. "Can I tell the Briggs kid?" "Tell him." He disappeared again, and they heard the rapid communication of 2 boys exchanging significant news, and then a sound that was probably both of them landing on the loft floor at the same time. Cole looked at Margaret. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow," she agreed. He picked up his hat. "I'm going to check the horses." "Cole." He stopped. "Thank you," she said, "for coming down the mountain that day." He looked at her for a moment with the full weight of his attention, which she had learned was how Cole Hargrove said things he didn't have words for yet. "Thank you for being there when I did," he said. They rode into Copper Falls on Friday morning. The street was not normal. Margaret registered that immediately. There were more people than a Friday warranted, clustered in small groups outside the Mercantile and the Inn and the assay office, talking with the particular energy of a town in the middle of processing something significant. Ruth was on the inn porch before they'd fully dismounted. "Garrett got here this morning," she said, low and quick. "Brought 2 deputies and a territorial marshal. Voss's man tried to leave town last night with 3 horses packed heavy. Alderman stopped him." She paused. "Chester Doyle has been talking since yesterday. Apparently loyalty to Harlan Voss evaporates fairly quickly when the alternative is a territorial prison sentence." "What did he give them?" Cole asked. "Enough." Ruth looked at him steadily. "Cole, Doyle was with Voss the night Ed Cass died." The street noise continued around them. Horses, voices, the distant sound of the mine. Cole was very still. "He says it wasn't an accident," Ruth said. "He says Cass told Voss about the silver vein, and when Cass wouldn't sell his silence, Voss arranged the riding accident himself." She paused. "Doyle was there. He watched it happen and said nothing for 3 years because Voss had his family's livelihood in his hands." She held Cole's gaze. "He also says your father didn't die of a heart attack." The word hit the air like something physical. "Ruth." Margaret put her hand on Cole's arm without thinking about it, and felt him absorb the contact without pulling away. "I'm sorry," Ruth said simply. "I know this isn't the way to hear it." Cole stood on the main street of Copper Falls, with the summer pressing down and the town moving around him, and whatever was happening in his face, he kept it his own. Margaret felt his arm under her hand and didn't let go. "Where is Voss now?" he said. His voice was completely level, which took more than most people understood.
"Territorial Marshal's office, voluntarily cooperating."
Ruth's mouth compressed. "For now. He has lawyers en route from Cheyenne." "Of course he does." "It won't help him. Not this time." Ruth looked at both of them. "Garrett wants to speak with you before the formal proceedings this afternoon."
Inspector Garrett looked like a man who had not slept in 36 hours and was fueled entirely by the satisfaction of a case coming together after years of watching it not come together. He shook Cole's hand and nodded at Margaret with the particular respect of a man who understood who had organized the evidence that made all of this possible. "The Denver deed is confirmed as a forgery," he said without preamble. "The paper was aged chemically, a technique that was fashionable in land fraud circles around 1880 and has since been well documented. Our document examiner identified it in 4 hours." He paused. "Voss had it prepared years ago as a fail-safe. The irony is that if he'd filed it immediately, before the science for detecting it was developed, it might have worked." "What happens to him?" Margaret asked. "Formal charges this afternoon. Land fraud, falsification of public records, conspiracy." Garrett looked at Cole. "Regarding your father and Ed Cass, Doyle's testimony opens a homicide investigation. That's a longer process, but it opens." He held Cole's gaze. "I want you to understand that this morning, the Territorial Court issued an emergency injunction restoring your original survey boundaries. The North Pasture is yours. Legally, clearly, on record." He paused. "It was always yours. Now it's documented as always yours." Cole nodded. "One more thing." Garrett opened the file on his desk and removed a single sheet. "Among Voss's records seized this morning, we found correspondence with your father from 1885. The letter your father wrote withdrawing his water rights complaint." He held it out. "Your father didn't withdraw it willingly. The letter was drafted by Voss's lawyer. Your father's signature is at the bottom." He paused. "Written under duress." Cole took the letter, read it slowly. Margaret watched his face go through something private and complete and devastating, and then come out the other side, into something quieter and more settled than it had been. "He didn't give up," Cole said, quietly. "Not to Garrett. Not really to anyone in the room." "No," Garrett said. "He didn't." Cole folded the letter and put it in his vest pocket, next to the place where Margaret knew he kept his father's watch. The formal proceedings were brief and absolute. Harlan Voss stood in the Territorial Marshal's office in a suit that cost more than most men in Copper Falls made in a year, and looked, for the first time in Margaret's observation of him, like a man whose calculations had come up short. The exactly right width smile was absent. His lawyers flanked him and said things in careful legal language, and the Territorial Marshal said things back in clearer language, and at the end of it, Voss was remanded to territorial custody pending trial on 4 counts of fraud and 2 counts of conspiracy. He looked at Cole once, across the room. Cole looked back at him with the flat gray regard of the mountain itself. Not triumphant, not angry, just present and immovable. And Voss looked away first. That was the whole of it. Tom Briggs shook Cole's hand outside the marshal's office with both of his and did not let go for a moment longer than a handshake required. "My daughter," he said. His voice was doing something that wasn't quite steady. "Whatever you need, whenever you need it, for the rest of my life." "I need you to keep running the feed store," Cole said. "The mountain needs grain." Tom laughed. It was the laugh of a man putting something down that had been very heavy for a very long time. His daughter, standing beside her mother, looked at Margaret with the clear eyes of a 16-year-old who had spent the past week afraid and was now the other thing. "Miss Holt," she said. "Mrs. Hargrove," she corrected herself. "Thank you." "You're welcome to come to the schoolhouse," Margaret said, "if you want to sit in. The younger children could use a reader. Someone their age, not an authority figure." The girl looked at her mother, then back. "Really?" "I don't say things I don't mean." "No," Danny said from beside her. "She really doesn't." Ruth's inn that evening was the fullest it had been since the mine's 3rd anniversary. And Ruth was the eye of it. Moving, pouring, receiving the particular gratitude of a town that had been held under someone's thumb for long enough that the release felt like a physical thing, like pressure dropping before rain. Margaret sat at the bar and let the noise happen around her and wrote in her journal. Not columns this time, not names and dates and amounts. She wrote 3 lines that were actually a poem, and then stopped and looked at what she'd written, and for the first time in 8 years was not embarrassed by it. Cole settled onto the stool beside her. He looked at the journal. "Is that—" "Don't read it yet." "Wasn't going to." He poured his coffee. "I've got patience." "I know you do." She closed the journal. "I'm going to read it to you. Later, when it's finished." She paused. "I've been writing things for 8 years that nobody ever heard. I'd like someone to hear them." He looked at her with that full attention. "I'd like to hear them." "Good." She picked up her cup. "Then that's settled." Danny appeared from across the room where he'd been talking to Clara Webb's father about something with considerable enthusiasm and less volume control than was strictly necessary. He dropped onto the stool on Margaret's other side and helped himself to a piece of bread from the basket on the bar with the ease of a boy who had stopped calculating whether he was welcome. She noticed. She didn't say anything about it. Some things were better honored by not interrupting them. "Danny," Cole said, "what did Dr. Morrison say about the leg?" "Fine." Danny ate his bread. "He said completely healed. He also said I should thank Mrs. Hargrove for the initial treatment because the drawing salve was what kept it from turning." He looked at Margaret sideways. "So, thank you. For the drawing salve." "You're welcome. For the drawing salve." "And for—" He paused. He was chewing, but that wasn't entirely why he was pausing. "For the other things." She looked at him, this grave, careful, hawk-watching boy who had asked for her by name from the back of a horse on a mountain trail, and had been right about her answer before she gave it. "Danny," she said, "you can call me whatever feels true." He was quiet for a moment. "I've been thinking about it," he said, "since you said that." He looked at his bread. "My mother left, and I know that wasn't about me. Uncle Cole explained it enough times that I understand it wasn't about me." He looked up. "But I stopped trusting that people stay." He paused. "You stayed, even when it got—" He gestured vaguely at the general concept of the past 2 weeks. "Complicated?" she said. "I was going to say dangerous, but yes." He looked at her directly, those dark eyes that were so much his uncle's. "I'd like to call you something that means you're staying, if that's—" He stopped, tried again. "If you're going to stay." "I'm staying," she said, not soft, not qualified, the same way she'd said yes on the mountain, direct and complete. He nodded once. Then, quietly,
with the particular courage of a 13-year-old choosing something that could hurt him, and choosing it anyway. Okay, Margaret. Not Miss Holt, not Mrs. Hargrove. Her name, chosen deliberately, which meant something different from a title, something that placed him beside her rather than below her. She put her hand briefly on the back of his, the way she'd done with 100 students over 8 years when they got something right that mattered. He didn't pull away. Cole was looking at neither of them, which meant he had heard every word and needed a moment that was his own. They rode up the mountain in the long summer evening, the three of them and the pack horse, and the particular quiet that followed a thing being finished. Halfway up, Danny's horse moved ahead on the familiar trail, and he gave it room to go, and Margaret and Cole rode side by side in the space he left. "I want to show you something," Cole said. "Now?" "When we get home." He said the word without marking it, which was how she knew it was real. "I've been building something in the barn. Before any of this started." He paused. "I stopped when things got complicated because it seemed like the wrong time. I want to finish it." "What is it?" "A bookshelf." He looked straight ahead at the trail. "For the front room. I ran out of space on the existing one after you brought your Tennyson and your 3 volumes of American history and whatever that enormous brown thing is on the bottom shelf." "Natural philosophy," she said. "It's reference material." "It's enormous."
Knowledge frequently is. He almost smiled. "The new shelf will fit it." He paused. "I measured." She thought about a man who had measured a shelf for her books before she'd said yes. Before she'd ridden up the mountain. Before she'd walked through his door in the way that changed what the door meant. "Cole?" "You measured the shelf before I agreed to marry you." "I measured it the morning after Danny asked if you'd mind him staying a few days." He said it without embarrassment. "I figured if you came up here and saw the books didn't fit, it would be a poor first impression." "You were already planning for me to come." "I was hoping." He looked at her. "There's a difference." She looked back at him and thought about hope as a deliberate choice. The kind you made when you already knew what loss felt like, and you chose hope anyway. She knew something about that. She'd been making that choice since a parlor in Boston, when she'd walked out with her teaching certificate and her pride and nothing else, and had kept making it every quiet evening in a residence that held only her own breathing until the morning a man filled her doorway with a boy in his arms and said, "Help him," like she was the only solid thing in the world. She had been. For him. And he had become the same for her, without ceremony, without announcement, the way the important things always happened, gradually and then completely. "Cole," she said. "Yeah?" "When we get home." She held his gaze. "Read me something. From the Whitman." He was quiet for a moment. "Which poem?" "The one about the road." She looked ahead at the mountain trail. "The one about going forward." He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand the way he had on the trail down to Cheyenne. Briefly, firmly, like steadying something worth holding. This time, he didn't let go for considerably longer. Above them on the trail, Danny was already talking to his horse about the hawk nest on the north trail and whether the juveniles had fledged yet. His voice easy and certain in the evening air. The voice of a boy who knew where he was going because he knew where he belonged. 6 weeks later, Margaret finished the poem she'd started in Ruth's Inn on the night Voss was taken into custody. She read it to Cole by lamplight, while Danny slept in the loft, and the summer night pressed warm against the ranch house windows. Cole listened the way he listened to everything that mattered, with his whole self, nothing held in reserve. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment.
Again, he said. She read it again. That's what it was like, he said. Meeting you. That's exactly what it was like. He looked at the lamp rather than her, the way he looked away when something hit him squarely. I didn't know anyone could put that into words. I've been putting things into words for 8 years, she said. I just didn't have anyone to read them to. He looked at her then, with the full geography of his face open to her. The scar and the gray and the depth of him. The mountain man who read Whitman and built bookshelves and measured them before he asked. Who had ridden down with his nephew, bleeding, and walked in like she was solid ground. You have someone now, he said. She closed the journal. Yes, she said. I do. Outside on the mountain, the summer night was warm and vast and full of the sounds of a living place. Wind in the pines, the horses moving in the barn, the distant call of something hunting in the dark. The north pasture sat legal and whole under the stars, its silver veins undisturbed beneath the grass where Cole's father had worked, and where Cole would go on working, running horses on land that had always been his and was now documented as such, permanently, on record that no one would alter again. Danny's pencil scratched once in the loft above them. He was still awake, still writing, still watching and recording the world with the careful attention of a boy who had decided the world was worth the trouble. Margaret opened the journal to a fresh page. She wrote 3 words at the top. What stays, stays. Then she set down her pen and picked up the Whitman and read aloud to her husband until the lamp burned low and the mountain held them, solid and permanent, in the life they had chosen and built and refused to let anyone take from them. They had come together out of practicality and necessity and a boy's fever on a July morning, and they had become, against every cautious calculation each of them had made about what they deserved, exactly what they had been afraid to hope for. The bookshelf held all her books. The mountain held their home. And Margaret Hargrove, who had spent 8 years learning to live without being loved, finally understood that the bravest thing she had ever done was not surviving alone. It was deciding, on the Thursday morning, with her best boots on and her heart in her throat, to stop.